everybody, this is Jill Morgan, and I want to welcome you today to Pulmonary Anatomy and Physiology. This is the first part of a four-part series for Chapter 1. So we're going to talk about anatomy and physiology of the upper airway to begin with. Anatomy, of course, is just the parts, and physiology is how those parts work. Here are 3 YouTube videos to help you understand how someone swallows, what happens when someone swallows something and it goes down the wrong way, and how the mucociliary transport system works. Terms that you need to know: ventilation, oxygenation, and respiration. Ventilation is simply the movement of air in and out of the lungs. Oxygenation is when tissues or cells actually get oxygen to them. And respiration is gas exchange. Now you're probably thinking, aren't respiration and ventilation the same thing? Nope. Again, remember that ventilation is just the movement of air in and out of the lungs. It's totally mechanical. Respiration is when oxygen and carbon dioxide is actually exchanged, and it happens in 2 places. So there's 2 kinds of respiration: internal and external. External is just what it sounds like. It's the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide from an external source, air in the lungs, to the capillaries. And we're going to talk more about that in detail. Internal respiration happens between the capillaries and the tissue. So those are the 2 types of respiration. So let's talk about what kind of airways you have in this system. Airways do a few things. They provide a passageway in and out of the lungs, all the way down to the alveoli. The upper airways are larger. They moisturize and humidify, and they are made up of the nose, the oral cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx. The lower airways are actually broken down into 2 parts, and we're going to talk about those 2 parts separately. We're going to talk first about the conducting zone in part 2, and then in part 3 we're going to talk about the respiratory zone. Now, all of the upper airway is considered part of the conducting zone. So, upper airways. This is a great picture. It's in your book, of the nose, the oral cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, and all of its parts. All of the conducting airways are considered anatomic dead space. We're going to talk more in a later video about anatomic dead space, but what you need to know now is that there's no gas exchange taking place in the conducting zone. It's simply a tube for passage. We don't get actual gas exchange until down in the alveoli. We're going to talk about where that starts and where that happens in a much greater detail. But again, the entire upper airway, part of the conducting zone, and it's considered anatomic dead space. There are 4 functions for the upper airways. They conduct warm air in and out of the body. They either warm or cool the air, depending on how hot it is outside, and they humidify all the air you breathe in. Another function of the upper airways is to protect the airway so that you don't get dirt, bugs, grasses, nasty gases. Even a lot of bacteria and viruses are screened out by the airway. Now, is that all of them? No, we know that's not the case. However, they do help to protect the airway. And the last function is speech and smell. So, Have you ever thought about why do you sneeze? Well, you sneeze because that's part of the protection mechanisms of the upper airway. Your upper airway is irritated by something. Maybe it's a noxious fume, maybe it's pollen, and you sneeze. And when you sneeze, you eject whatever it is that's been irritating you. So let's talk about the nose. There are a few things that you need to know about the nose and a few names for the parts. First thing is the nares. Those are your nose holes. They're found here. The second thing you should know are the concha, and another name for the concha are the turbinates. They're here in the main part of the nose, and they help to warm, heat, and humidify air that comes into your nose before it gets down to your lungs. Can you imagine if the air was completely dry and it went down to the lungs? It would dry out our alveoli and nothing flat. So we can't have that. So it heats, humidifies, and then filters. So it helps to filter things out with the little nasal hairs that are inside of the nose. And yes, you need to know the name of those hairs. They're called vibrissae. Vibrissae help to filter out anything large that gets into the nose. The other thing that the nose does is it's important for your sense of smell, and it helps generate resonance when you talk. So anybody know what the outside of your nose is called? The little tip of your nose? Well, that is called the alar cartilages. So there are greater and lesser alar cartilages, but together they make up your little tip of your nose, and they help give your nose shape. The bridge of your nose is actually the lateral nasal cartilage, and then above that, right between your eyes, you have the actual nasal bones. So I have a question for you. What is another term for concha? Don't look at your book. See if you can remember, because we just talked about it. It is turbinates. And yes, that is a test question. So please be sure that you remember that. So we talked a little bit about functions of the nose, but they're important. And so again, remember that there are three main functions: heat, humidity, and to filter. So how does it heat up? Well, it's highly vascularized. That's why people get nosebleeds. It will heat things to body temperature, which is 37 degrees centigrade, versus room air, which is actually only about 20 degrees centigrade. So it's heating at about 17 degrees. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it is. And it makes all the difference in the world. The other thing it does is it provides about 75% relative humidity. So air going down to your lungs is about 75% saturated, which is good. We're going to talk more about humidity and how to do humidity calculations at a later time. But for now, just know that most of the humidity is provided by the nose. And then you have little tiny, those hair follicles called vibrissae that provide defense from outside particles. There's 4 types of epithelium throughout the different airways. And your book has a great picture in figure 1.5. So if you look at the color coding of the picture, you can see that right in the beginning of the nose and at the very back of the throat in the oral pharynx, you have non-ciliated stratified squamous epithelium. Whew, that's a mouthful. Basically, what it means is you don't have those little finger-like projections, but you do have different layers of squamous epithelium. Why is this important in the nose and in the mouth? Well, because think about things that cut your mouth up, that you put things in your mouth, and how tough the outer part of your nose needs to be. So that stratified squamous means that there are multiple layers. You can lose a layer, like when you drink too much hot coffee too fast, you might burn your mouth and lose the top layer of that squamous epithelium. Well, never fear, you've got more underneath. The second type of epithelium that I want to talk about is the pseudostratified. So it looks stratified, but it is really one layer, and it's in little columns. It also is ciliated. What does ciliate mean? Well, it means it has little finger-like projections at the top of it, and they're what help wave the mucus up and out. That's in the back of your nose. It's also in your biggest of your airways, the bronchi, and all throughout the trachea. The next part is simple cuboidal epithelium. So it's shaped like little ice cubes, tiny little cubes. It's one layer. That's why it's called simple. And it lines the smaller airways. That's all of the green parts that you see on the picture. And then we get down to D, the last one that we're going to talk about, which is simple squamous instead of stratified. Simple means it's one layer of squamous cells, and they're super thin. And why are they super thin? Well, it's so you can exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide easily. And if you look at the pink where you see this is in the respiratory zone of the airways. Next, we're going to talk about the pharynx. The pharynx is important. Your vocal cords are in there. The trachea is in there. You can see the vallecula surrounding the vocal folds. And also, at the very top of it is the base of your tongue. So if you think about the back of your tongue, what's under there? Well, that's the epiglottis, the vocal folds, the vallecula, the trachea. All of those are after or behind your tongue. Also, you've got the cricoid cartilage, and on the other side, the esophagus. So the esophagus and the trachea are very close together. The difference is that the trachea is surrounded by the vocal folds, and we want air to go in and out of the trachea, and we want food to go down into the esophagus. You can see here you've got in A you've got a picture that's a drawing. In B, you've got the real thing. You can see the trachea, the vocal folds, and the tissue surrounding the vocal folds, which is the vestibular fold, or a false vocal cord here. True vocal cord here, false vocal cord here. So, three main parts of the pharynx. The nasopharynx, which is the top part of the pharynx. The oral pharynx, which is right behind the mouth, the back part of it. And then the laryngopharynx, which is what you see here, the lowest one down, right above the esophagus and above those true vocal folds. These areas include the tonsils and lymph tissue. So I have a question for you. And don't look. Which structure, when you look at the picture, extends from the posterior nares to the upper portion or superior portion of the soft palate? Can any of you think of it? It's one of the three. It is the nasopharynx. Good job. So we're going to move a little lower down. We're going to move into the larynx. So the larynx consists of the epiglottis, thyroid cartilage, antenoid cartilages, cricoid cartilages, and corniculate cartilages. Yeah, they're hard to say, but they're pictured here. So this is the green thing is the epiglottis. This pink stuff is the thyroid cartilage. This two little portions here are the arytenoid cartilages. This is the cricoid cartilage. And then these two tiny little purple parts are the corniculate cartilages. So the larynx is the point that divides the upper and lower from the lower airways. It's the end of the upper airway system. Its function is to make sure gas goes down to the trachea, protect the lungs, have a cough reflex or Valsalva maneuver, and speech. So I want to talk in a detail a little more about the antenoid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. The antenoid cartilage is around the vocal cord network. It protects it, and it's a landmark for intubation. The cricoid is, again, the largest part of an infant's airway and the only complete ring of cartilage. The rest are only C-shaped. You can see in this picture the antenoid cartilage is pictured in blue and the cricoid cartilage is pictured in yellow. So I have a couple questions for you. Which laryngeal cartilage is primarily responsible for preventing food, liquids, and foreign bodies from entering the lower airways? Anybody remember? Acts like a little check valve. It flips closed over the tracheal opening. Give you any hints? It's the epiglottis. Next question. to what structure does the upper portion of the thyroid cartilage attach by a membrane? Do you remember where that thyroid cartilage attaches? It's the hyoid bone. So I want to talk a little bit about oral endotracheal tube intubation. So with oral tube endotracheal intubation, you can see in the picture, where is it going? Is it going into the esophagus and the stomach? Nope. In the clinical setting, many respiratory therapists are the ones who do the intubation. So when you look, you're going to look for the vocal cords and the opening in between so that you can get that ET tube into the trachea. Through the oral pharynx, past the oral pharynx into the trachea. So if you look, I want you to see that when you intubate somebody, what am I bypassing? I'm bypassing the nose. That's where we heat and humidify everything. So I have to, on my ventilator, I have to make sure that my ventilator is heated to body temperature, and I have to make sure that it's properly humidifying the air that the person is breathing, because I've bypassed our natural warming, humidifying, and filtering system. So those are all things to take into consideration. Okay, so what happens if my ET tube is inadvertently or by accident advanced too far? And it happens all the time out in the field and in the ER. Where does it go if it goes in too far? Well, it'll direct itself because of the way the right main stem is a little bit higher and the slant's a little bit different. It'll go right into the right main stem. And so what you'll hear is no breath sounds on the left, and on the right lung you'll hear really loud breath sounds. And so that's how you know you have to pull back just a little bit and then retape your ET tube or resecure it if you're using a securing device. So we're going to talk about some of the things that can happen, and one of them I want to talk about briefly is acute epiglottitis. Now this epiglottis should be really tiny, but what you see here is it's so swollen it can cut off the entire airway. Here's the vocal cords down here, so it's supraglottal, means it's above the glottis. It's above this opening, and so it can cut off the entire airway, and it's a true airway emergency. This is a bacterial infection of the epiglottis, making it swell. We call this on X-ray, this is a lateral neck X-ray pictured in figure 112. And so you can see this in your book and read about it. But on that lateral neck X-ray, you can see what we call thumb sign. That's a telltale sign that this person has acute epiglottitis and not croup. Croup and epiglottitis sound, when you're listening, very similar. They can both create stridor. But if I get this person with acute epiglottitis upset, they can shut off their entire airway, and we'll have to do an emergency cricoidotomy. Here's croup syndrome so you can compare. So what you see in croup syndrome is what on the x-ray is where the arrows are pointing to is steeple sign. If you think of the peak of a church, a traditional church, they always had what we call a steeple. So the top was very narrow and skinny, the bottom widened out, and you can see this in the x-ray in figure 113. Now, you can see here in croup, the swelling for croup is below the vocal cords, so it's not as serious. It tends not to cut off the entire airway. We still have a passageway, the smallest part, especially in kids, to still breathe and move air through. And it's a viral infection. So, which of the following are functions of the upper airway? Do you remember? Is it conduction of gas to the lower airway? Yes or no? Prevention of foreign materials from entering the lower airway? Warming, filtering, and humidifying inspired gas? Or aiding in speech and smell? Any of these or all of these, which is it? I want you to take a second and think about it. It's all of the above. So, if you see this question again on a short quiz, I want you to remember that it is conduction of gas to the lower airway, prevention of foreign material from entering the lower airway, warming, filtering, and humidifying inspired gas, and aid in speech and smell. So that's the functions of the entire upper airway. So thank you for listening today, and you're ready to go on to part 2.